Assalamualaikum and a very good day. My name is ARISYA SHAHIRAH binti ANWAR MIRZA, and I'm going to start the proposal presentation of our project, and my groupmate will then continue with their part. So moving on to the first section, that is topic. During the early stage, we come up with many possible topics from various categories. Firstly, we plan to talk about current issue and news such as the coronavirus pandemic, the movement control order in Malaysia, and also cyberbullying. We also thought about making a motivational podcast for university students and sharing about how to manage online classes. Other than that, we also discussed about telling history or classic stories such as Hikayat Mirong Mahawangsa. After further discussion among team members, we have decided on three general topics, that is online learning, quarantine and movies. We will then pass a Google form to our audience for them to drop their question or choose a topic that they want us to discuss in our podcast. For example, for topic movies, they can ask us to suggest an inspirational movies or talk about the plot of a movie or anything. We will let the audience decide what they want to hear. Next, reason for rejecting the other topic. We ask ourselves for each topic. Will it add value to their life? Will it make them a better person in some way? Will they sit and listen to the entire episode? And is this the content that they are craving? So we want to avoid topics that could not satisfy the question. The topic that are not interesting. The topic that cannot catch our audience attention. And the topic that our audience cannot easily relate to. We don't want our audience to question themselves. Is listening to this 1 hour video recording is worth it? We want them to be excited, eager, and motivated to listen to our podcast. Since we are in pandemic, we figure out that we need to face reality and keep ourselves updated with the things that are going around in the world. And of course in our country itself. We also realize that everyone is struggling now. Whether freelancer, worker, business owner, and even student. The least we can do to help is to hear their struggle and suggest solution. We hope this alternative will help our audience in some way. Other than that, we want to make a fun, relaxing, and enjoyable topics. Topics that can lighten up the moods. The topic that we chose is movies and TV show. Audience can ask us any question they want. Maybe they want us to explain a movie or even a movie review. It is up to the audience. That brings us to reason for choosing the selected topic. We want to avoid boring short titles and boring content, as this can drive people away before they even take the time to listen. We want to make it interesting, so we want to provide content people will want to hear about. We want to craft the show and topics around what the audience are interested in and not solely on what we are interested in. And lastly, providing a value, a topic that can give the audience a reason to listen and give them a chance to take something away from the experience. We believe that when we provide value to the people, the rest can end up falling into place and the audience will enjoy the program. We want to make a topic that can make our podcast a fun, impactful sharing. So that is all. The next part will be continued by my group mate.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Moving on. So, why do we choose podcast? It's actually an entertainment and education rolled into one and tailor-made for our multitasking lives. So, what is actually podcast? Podcast is actually episodic series of spoken word digital audio files that a user can download to a personal device for easy listening. It's actually a new form of radio, and as we can see nowadays, the trend is getting increased because of the popularity of podcast itself. So there are 6 reasons why we choose podcast, except for the popularity. The first one is because it is very accessible. It is readily available and requires close to no preparation in the point of view from the podcast host. And it's actually a very good advantage, especially for us students, as we also have a lot of things to do at the same time, especially our subjects, and it is very helpful for us to do this podcast. The second reason is uh, it is podcast allow us to multitask, whether we are driving to work, we doing the dishes, or going for a run. We also can do a podcast anytime, any day, and anywhere, and it's actually an entertaining and acceptable companion for the listeners and also for the host to actually do the podcast. The third one is it is easy to make. It's very save our time and also affordable to make because um, we don't need a Hollywood producer or an account full of money to create a podcast. We actually no need I think a camera, a very high quality camera to do a podcast. We just need to record our voice and do the podcast itself. So in the point of view of a student, it is a very actually very helpful for us to actually save our money and also do our podcast at the same time. And also, many podcasts have launched out of basements, living rooms, and also kitchens. And it is a kind of very, I think, easy to make. That's the main point of doing the podcast. You can do it anywhere that we want. Okay, the fourth one is podcasts are actually versatile. It offers endless variety and options because whether we want to learn about how phytoplankton produce their own fuel or actually get a recap of the most recent Bachelor episode, there is always going to be a podcast for us. And it doesn't have a really rigid format to for us to do a podcast. We can actually let our creativity flows. The next one is it's actually intimate. Podcasts are intimate because it feel like we being with them physically. If actually when we're re-listening to a podcast or we're actually creating a podcast, it's actually we're creating a situation when we're sitting around the dinner table with these people. So it's actually very, I think, a new experience that we can gain. So the last one is the podcast is actually are adaptable. It is easy to change the format or style of podcasting. As I said earlier, podcasts don't have any rigid format that we need to follow. So because of the episodic nature of podcast hosts, we can also implement feedback from our listeners about our content, format, and also from guests itself faster than an author or a newspaper. So it is shows that why the listeners are also valuable and makes them loyal to a podcast. So I think that is a very great advantage. Uh, podcast over any other form or any other medium to do I think a sharing session. So it is these six reasons are the reason why we choose podcast to be our medium. So next one, it also the method of our podcasting. So first we will do an introduction. We will break the ice as we will share our opinions and introducing ourselves. And each one of us will share our opinions and perspective point of view. And it also let us to do a two-way communication because we don't want to be a one-way medium, and we can also get a little audience participation by asking open-ended questions and also can be featured in our future episodes, and we collect the feedback or the answers by using Google form, and also we just that's all, and we use open-ended questions and let the questions be in the Google form, and we blast it and collect the data and also use it for the next episodes. And other than that, we just have fun and just blend with the flow. And it's also a very kind of entertaining podcast content on our audience gets the excitement of having the answers read live on our show. So it's actually create a bonding between us and also the listeners. So that's it. The method of our podcasting from the Daily Sister Podcast.
Hi, my name is NURUL Afiqah Nizam, metric number A176904, and for my part, I'll be talking about the problems we face, the solution to those problems, and our work plan. So, without further ado, let's get into it. We faced a lot of problems during the early stages of this project. First of all, we had troubles in choosing the right project to do. As we all know, we are currently in the middle of the pandemic right now, and there were a lot of factors for us to consider before agreeing on one final project for us to do, because we wanted to make sure that with the project we choose, it can be easily done from the comfort of our own home. Second, we had difficulty in understanding each activity, such as webinars, podcasts, talk shows, forum. Which one do we choose? Because honestly, there's a lot of activities for us to choose from. But do not worry about that. I will talk about the solution later. And third, once we had done enough research, we have finally agreed on one project to do, which is podcast. But then we realized that we had no idea on how to conduct a proper podcast. Honestly speaking, yes, we do know in theory on how people usually carry out the podcast, but since we had no prior experience before, it will be very hard for us to start our own podcast session. Fourth, we also need to come up with interesting topics for us to talk about during the podcast session later on, because we do not want to bore our listeners to death, and as the host, we also want to have fun, talking during our podcast session. Fifth, if you notice, all of these problems, they all have one root cause, which is our own lack of experience, because this will be our first time in conducting a real podcast. So hopefully, with this project, we can learn a lot of things. Now I'm going to talk about the solution to those problems. First of all, what we did was we listed down the format for each activity, such as the formality, the time spent, and the platform used for us to carry out those activity. We compared the pros and cons of each activity, and we have finally agreed for podcasts to be the chosen one activity. Second, since we had no experience before this, we decided to watch and listen to other podcasts first to have a rough idea on how it's usually done. Luckily for us, a lot of podcast channels nowadays uploaded the video version of their podcast at YouTube, so we can just watch it there. And it is interesting because we can actually learn a lot from this video. We can see the setup, the microphone they use, all the stuff. Third, we also did our own research on how to start a podcast successfully, because like I say, we are very inexperienced. I don't know how many times I have repeated this, but we are very inexperienced, and the fact that we are very far from each other makes it even harder for us to carry out this activity, but we will try our best. So what we did was we went through various websites and we jotted down the important things that we need to pay attention to, so that we can use it to our full knowledge once we have started the podcast session later. Fourth, we also had this brainstorming session between the group members for us to come up with interesting and fun topics for us to talk about later in the podcast session, such as movies, quarantine life, and online studies. Those are the topics that are currently happening right now, and a lot of people can relate to it. So we are sure that with those topics, we will have a lot of things for us to talk about. We will have a lot of fun, and people will also want to listen to it willingly, since it's a topic that they can easily relate to. And fifth, we will try our best to stay positive despite the problems we have faced and the problems we will face later on. We will also do enough practice before we carry out the real podcast session, because we want it to be as smooth as possible in the future. Lastly, we have arrived to the work plan of your Daily Sister podcast project. For the first week, we had course briefing and group formation, all those usual stuff. And up to the 5th week, we listened to other podcast channel for us to have some experience. Now, I'm going to talk about our future plan here. Our future plan, which is mainly consisted of a lot of preparation. We had decided for this project, we will do 3 episodes, 3 podcast sessions. What we're going to do is, first, we are going to make sure that we have done enough preparation. Once we're sure of that, we will carry out the podcast session itself. After each podcast session, we will be collecting feedbacks from our viewers and listeners. We will go through those feedbacks and we will try our best to improve ourselves so that the next podcast session will be better than the previous ones. And this will be applied to all 3 episodes. And hopefully, all those activities will be accumulated up to 120 hours. That's all from me. Thank you.
Hi, moving on to the next section. My name is NABILAH binti AZMI with the matrix number A174541. I would be presenting for the next section. So for our next section, it is our target audiences. So we have only 2 target audience. First would be students and the second would be general public. For students, we choose students because they could highly relate to our topics since we are students ourselves, and because second, they would be the first reach for our Google Form distribution since we're gonna distribute it to our friends through WhatsApp groups and most of our friends are students. Okay, the second one would be the general public. We chose the general public because our platforms would be Spotify and YouTube, which is accessible to every single person on earth. And also, the topics we chose is basically prioritized on students, but the general public could relate to it as well, so they could listen and appreciate what our content would be. Okay, so moving on to our next section. Our next section would be other project-related matters. So basically, our first concern would be how to attract people. Our strategies are first, promoting on social media by posting episodes. The second one would be sharing our podcast sessions with friends and families. The third one would be crafting a great title for each and every episode to engage listeners, first-time listeners to listen to our podcast because first impression matters. The fourth one would be designing an attractive cover art, just like the title, because we totally emphasize that first impression matters. With a great cover art, with a great title, people would be, for first-time listeners, it would be an attractive site for people to engage to our podcast. Our second concern would be on how to engage super listeners / fans. Okay, our first move would be creating a catchy podcast intro to engage people to be a fan of our podcast. The second one would be adding a subtle but engaging theme song. The third one is being consistent in posting our podcast episodes or doing our podcast sessions because consistency is the key to success. Consistency creates habit, basically. So with consistency, people would be, for example, right, like if people are attracted to our first few contents, and then if we're consistent to it, people would totally be attracted and be like a full-time supporter of our podcast. Okay, so the fourth one would be creating like a fandom name for our podcast. Like if people listen to podcasts, it would be podcasters. So our podcast name would be like Your Average Daily Sisters. So we could have a fandom. We could totally have a fandom name like Sisters. So whenever we start our podcast session, it would be like, hey sisters, things like that. Okay, all right. Moving on to our next and last concern, okay, which would be on how to avoid unnecessary rambling during each and every podcast session. So our suggestion or our idea or our strategy, the first one would be writing an outline for each and every podcast session so that we could have a smooth flow of conversation written by every member. Okay, so our second move would be rehearsing for each podcast session before each episode, so that we could identify the situation, what's the atmosphere gonna be. So I think that's all from us. Thank you. Bye.